Hello, dear friends. Um, I'm writing about Parashat Chayai Sara, but I'm calling this talk the story of Yishmael because we have three parshiot, three portions in the Torah which talk about Yishmael, and it's from Parashat Lech Lecha to Parashat Vayera to Parashat Chayai Sara, and the end of the story is here in Parashat Chayai Sara. So I thought it would be appropriate to talk about the story of Yishmael in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, and the unusual relationship which develops between Yishmael and Isaac, Yitzchak. So let's start a little bit from the beginning in a story of how Yishmael comes to be. As you remember, Abraham marries Sarah. Sara is his niece, it appears, especially according to the Midrash, who claims that Yiska, the daughter of Haran, is actually Sara. That would actually be his niece, and it would be a sister of Lot. But even according to the simple, what we call the simple narrative of the Bible, of the Torah, you can see also that Abraham says about Sarah on two occasions, Omnam achoti bat avi avalo batimi. She happens to be my sister from my father, but not from my mother. When he with Avimelech, etc., and Pharaoh, etc. So for 10 years they're living in the land of Canaan, and they cannot bring children. And then Sarah decides that Abraham should have a child with Hagar, with let's call it a shifcha, as she's concerned. In other words, Sarah is going to take a servant, and that servant's child will be the child of Abraham. By the way, in literature from that time in Mesopotamia, the Ishnunu documents, the Hammurabi documents, it appears that when a matriarch has a child through a servant, the servant becomes the matriarch's child together with her husband. And so there's certain legal issues there in antiquity, and this seems to be the way that Sarah sees this too. If I can't have a child, maybe through my servant I'll have a child, and it will be mine. So this is a story, Bereshit chapter 16. But Sarai Eshet Avram lo yaldalo. Sarah did not have a child, but she did have a servant, and her servant's name was Hagar. And Sarai says to Abraham, God has held me back from having a child. So if you can conceive together with Hagar, my servant, I can be built through her. Maybe I'll be built through her. And so Abraham listens to Sarah, to what he says, and then Sarah, the wife of Abraham, takes Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, after the 10 years that they've been in the land of Canaan, childless, and gives it to Abraham for a wife. Now, story continues. Hagar has a child, conceives a child with Abraham, and when she realizes that she's pregnant, it says in verse 4, Vatikal gvirta be'eineha. She belittled Sarah in her eyes. She started looking down at Sarah. In other words, you think you're the real matriarch, but I'm the one who's bringing the child. So who are you? This bothers Sarah. First of all, as I said, she knows the law, and by the law, the servant's child is hers. But secondly, why belittle her? Because she's barren, that's a reason to belittle her? What type of person are you? So Sarah says to Abraham, she doesn't turn to Hagar, Chamasi alecha. I'm angry with you. I gave you my servant, and now that she is pregnant, I am belittled by her. May God judge between you and between me. Meaning, if I'm being emotional about this, I'm getting it the wrong way, may God be the judge, because God is objective. But I feel that something's wrong here. She's belittling me. That's not what was supposed to happen. So Avram says to Hagar, look, and I will add, it was your idea. It doesn't say that in the text, but I'm just adding to that, what we call between the words. The servant, this is your servant. She's your servant, Hagar. You do what you think is correct. Vate'aneha Sarai vativrach mipanea. And Sarah afflicted her. It doesn't say what she did, but she did things which were unpleasant for Hagar, and Hagar ran away. What is it that v'tahaneha? So there are different interpretations here. Rashi says she gave her a little bit harder work to do, whatever it was, but something about it, v'tahaneha, because of that, she runs away. Now the story becomes interesting, or more interesting, because all of a sudden, Hagar in the desert, this pregnant woman, an angel appears to her. And the angel of God appears to Hagar at a fountain of water, meaning a wellspring, in the desert. Al Ha'ain, again, another term for a fountain, B'derech Shur, on the way to the desert of Shur. And he said, Hagar, you are the servant of Sara. Calls her Hagar, the servant of Sara. Where are you coming from? Do you know, where are you going? And Hagar answers the angel and says, I'm running away from Sara, my master. And the angel of God said, go back to your matriarch, to your master, and be afflicted under her hand, which means even if she afflicts you, go back. You need her, I'm adding. And again, the angel of God said to Hagar, don't worry, your seed will be a great nation. It will be countless. And again, the angel of God says to Hagar, Hinachara, as you know, you are pregnant, and you shall have a son, and his name will be Yishmael. Yishmael in Hebrew means God listens. Ki shama Hashem et yonech, God has heard your affliction. So don't worry, you will receive your reward. And this child who will be born, Yishmael, he will be paradam, he'll be a wild man. His hand will be everywhere, and everybody's hand will be in his. Ve'al pnei kol echav yishkon, and he shall be scattered among his brethren. And Hagar, after this vision, she called the name of God, who was speaking to her through the angel, you, my God, El Roi, you are the God of my sight, of my vision. Because she said, Hagam halam ra'iti, acharei ra'i, because I can now see better after my vision, meaning my God of vision has appeared to me. And then she called the well that she found there in the desert, Be'er Lachai Roi, and it's between Kadesh and Bared. Be'er Lachai Roi, the well of the eternal life and vision. And then she had a son, and Abraham called the son Yishmael, which means that Abraham was also aware, I guess, in divine inspiration or prophecy, that the name has to be Yishmael. What is the meaning of this small story, which is told here, of Hagar running away? When the angel says to Hagar, go back to Sarah and be afflicted under her, meaning it's worth it to be there. Why is it worth it to be there? Why is Yishmael called hearing? And why does Hagar called God, the God of my sight, of my vision? Basically, if you look, there are certain hints here in the text that I want to point out just to consolidate the idea which I'm going to say. You see, the idea here is the angel is saying, Sarah is your vision. You can hear, your son definitely will have even a divine ability to hear, meaning he'll be very committed to his relationship to God, but he won't have vision. He won't have the proper guidance. You need it from Sarah. Sarah and Abraham, they'll give you the guidance. They'll tell you which way to be directed. But if not, you'll be with the audio without the visual, and you will be lost. Because the vision is the map, and the audio is the explanation, but you need the map. Now, if you look into this chapter, there's something very interesting here. If you look from the beginning, as soon as Hagar becomes pregnant, the verb to see in various forms is found 10 different times. So it seems to be a motif in this chapter. It says, again, Abraham conceived with Hagar, and Hagar saw she was pregnant, and her master, meaning her mistress, became belittled in her eyes. That's number one. And then verse 5, Sarah says to Abraham, I became belittled in her eyes. That's number two. And Abraham says to Sarah, do whatever you want, whatever is good in your eyes. That's what you should do to Hagar as she runs away. And then, that's number three. We're up to three. And then she is found by God's angel, al Ein Hamayim. Now, Ein, you have a play on words, because Ein means a fountain, a natural spring of water, but it's also the same letters of the word Ein, which means an eye. So we're up to four. And this is in the desert. And it's in the desert right next to the other fountain, also the word Ein, which means a fountain and an eye, number five, on the way to the desert of Shur. And Shur in Hebrew is both the name of a place and also means to look. That's number six. And then it continues in verse 8. And then Hagar's, and here she's called a servant of Sara, to make the point that the angel wants her to understand she's got to remain that way. Where are you going? What is your direction? She says. Tell me, I want to know where you're coming from, what your direction is. In other words, the angel's trying to prove to her she's without direction, without Sarah. And she says, well, I know where I'm coming from. I ran away from Sarah. That's where I'm coming from. And the Malach says, go back to your mistress, and you must be afflicted under her hand. She'll show you the way. And then again, as I said, the angel says she'll have many children. It says, and his name will be Yishmael, because he can hear. And God has heard you, but you need the vision of Sarah, etc., etc. And she called the God who was speaking to her, you are the God of my sight. That's number 7. Because now I have seen after this the sight of God. We're up to 9. And therefore she called the well of eternal life and sight, number 10. 10 times the idea of vision, of seeing, of eye, meaning the eye, because this is the motif. The angel early on, before the birth of Yishmael, tells Hagar, you've got to remain with Sarah. She's going to guide you. She's going to show you the way. She has that ability. You didn't get along at the beginning, work on it. She will be able to show you the way. This is place 1. Now there is story 2. And story 2 takes place in the next pericope, in the next parsha, the next portion, Vayera. And Vayera, you again have the story of the banishing of, but this time not just of Hagar, but also Yishmael after he is born. And after Sarah has a child whose name was Isaac, Yitzchak, when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. So there's a story here that says, Vatera Sarah noticed that the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, who was born to Abraham, he was playing. Now the Midrash has interesting thing. So what's wrong with playing? So one Midrash saying he was playing violently with Isaac, pretending to throw arrows at him. Another time, there's a Midrash that says Mitzachek. Rashi brings another Midrash. There was sexual interaction. Whatever it was, usually the word Mitzachek or tzchok can very often be talking about something which leads to immorality. Whatever it is, she's not happy with the relationship between Yishmael and Isaac, and feels that it has a negative influence on her son, who is, of course, much younger than him. And she says to Abraham, I want you to banish this servant and her child, because he will not inherit with my son Isaac. And Abraham felt really bad about this. Now remember, now God appears to Abraham and says, Do not fear. Don't feel bad about the lad and his mother, meaning Hagar and Yishmael. Everything Sarah says to you, do it, because through Isaac will continue your seed. So God, first of all, says, Isaac is the one that I told you all the time, and he'll be the continuation. So if Sarah said this, do it. Avram doesn't understand. But God says, don't worry. The child of this servant will also be a great nation because he's also your seed. So Abraham gets up in the morning and he takes bread, a flask of water, he gives it to Hagar, and she goes with the child, and they go into the desert of Beersheba. Abraham was living in the area of Beersheba. What's the flask of water? In my opinion, what's going on here, there's a test. This is a test to Abraham. And he knows it's a test, and he knows that God is saying, do it. And he believes there'll be an outcome, but he doesn't know what it is. Giving the flask of water to the mother, in my opinion, is Abraham wants to find out, is Ishmael really my son? Meaning, okay, he might not be the promised son like Isaac, but since he is my son, does he relate to me? Abraham, in Kabbalistic literature, is called the Midat HaChesed, which means the attribute of loving kindness. Water, very often, is a symbol of kindness because it gives life. It's a source of all life. So he wants to send. So he's sending Hagar and Yishmael into the desert where there's no water. He gives him a flask of water, and he wants to know if the child will find water in the desert. If so, that means that he has my attribute, the attribute of chesed, and there will come something good out of this child. The water runs out of the flask, and Hagar can't deal with it anymore. She throws the boy under one of the bushes. And she sits far away, saying, I don't want to see the boy die. And she cries and she wails. Does God hear her now this time, like the first time with the angel? No. Vayishma malach Elohim et kol anar. God hears the voice of the boy, Ishmael. And the angel now appears to Hagar after that, meaning God, because of Yishmael's voice of crying, that's why God now appears, and the angel of God says to Hagar, don't worry, what are you doing, Hagar? Why, in other words, why are you crying? Don't worry. God has heard the voice of the boy, but not yours. Where he is, because she threw him under the bushes. She lost all hope. You're not allowed to lose hope. You have the ability, the power to hear God. You can't lose hope. Kumi sitanar, pick the boy up and hold him in your arms. He's going to be a great nation. And God opened her eyes, remember the eyes, and she sees the well of water. And she fills up her flask and she gives the child to drink. And God was with the child. And he was in the desert, and he was a hunter with bow and arrow. And he lived in the desert of Paran, and his mother brought him a wife from Egypt. Okay. So, and of course, his name is Yishmael because that was from before. There's a lot to say here. For one thing, this test, in a certain way, that has parallels to what's kind of the binding of Isaac, which is going to be in this chapter 2 in Vayera, at the end of Vayera, in chapter 22. This is chapter 21. For instance, Avram doesn't understand. What does it mean when God says, you have to banish him, but he says nothing, just like he says nothing in the Akedah, in the binding of Isaac. But also an interesting thing in this particular story, this Vayesh came Abraham Baboker. Abraham got up early in the morning, exactly like in the Akedah story. In the Akedah story, he takes, of course, wood, and he takes the ma'achelet, which is the knife, And in this story, he gets up early in the morning, takes bread and takes water, and he gives it to Hagar, and she goes out into the desert. And also, there's the near-death experience of his son, Yishmael, just like there's going to be a near-death experience of Isaac in the binding of Isaac. And both of them will be saved. Ishmael is saved because God listens to his voice and sends an angel, and the angel shows Hagar that there's actually the well there, and that is Be'er Lachai Roi, which is the same well that actually Hagar had mentioned in the previous portion in Lech Lecha. So she sees it all of a sudden, meaning her eyes were open because she lacks. It's not that she doesn't see physically; sometimes she lacks sight. Now I want to turn to the end of Vayera, which is the binding of Isaac. I'm not going to go through the whole story of the binding of Isaac because that's not the topic. But the interesting thing of the binding of Isaac, which is almost the chapter right after, which is the chapter right after the story of Ishmael in the desert, and there's a slight with one story in the middle of Avimelech and the covenant with Abraham. But at the beginning of the chapter, also the Akedah of the binding of Isaac. So it says that Abraham comes with Isaac and with two other guys. And Abraham says to the two other lads, after God says to him to take his son as an offering. So it says, he says to them, verse 5 in chapter 22, you sit back here with the donkey, and myself and the lad, meaning Isaac, will go up there and we shall bow down and come back. But at the end of the story, it says, and Abraham went back to his two lads, and they went to Beersheba. Where was Isaac? Where did he go? So Isaac disappears. It's understandable in a sense. You would think it's traumatic. Your father standing there with a knife. He bound you hands and legs, and you're on there on the altar waiting, and you close your eyes, and then the last moment, you don't hear the angel saying to Abraham, do not send your hand to the child and don't do anything to him, because now I know that you are God-fearing. Because it's Abraham's prophecy, not Isaac's. So he's just sitting there with his eyes closed, probably waiting for it to happen, and it doesn't happen. And then all of a sudden, he sees his father taking a ram from the thicket, from the bushes, and bringing that and letting him go and untying him, telling him, now step down, the ram's going in your place. Probably thinking, why didn't you tell me that in the beginning? Of course, Abraham didn't know that in the beginning. But this was very traumatic for Isaac. He was willing to give up his life for his father's prophecy because he knew it was real. Isaac walks away. Where does he go? This we know from our Parsha Chayai Sara. How do we know where he went? Very simple. In next week's Parsha, meaning Chayai Sara, which was the Parsha I began talking about, you have here a story of the servant of Abraham, which according to the Midrash was Eliezer, who goes to look for a wife for Isaac. Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says that after the Akedah, after the binding of Isaac, when Abraham saw that, even though God's promise is that through Isaac you'll have a great nation, doesn't mean I can't be a little proactive. It was really nerve-wracking seeing that maybe I was going to lose Isaac. I realize now I'm not going to lose Isaac, but even so, there's no sin in being proactive. So he says to his servant, find him a wife. Let's get the ball rolling. Let him have children. If he's going to be a great nation, why can't I help God's promise come to fruition? That's what Rabbi Sachs says. And I want to say that Isaac has a bit of the same idea. Isaac knows that Ishmael is going to be a great nation too. And Isaac probably found out, because he was also a prophet, that Ishmael, there's a reason why Sarah didn't want Ishmael to grow up with him. She thought he was a bad influence. But Isaac knew who Ishmael was, and he wasn't 100% sure that was true. He was probably thinking all that Ishmael is lacking is guidance, vision. Somebody has to be there. You can't just keep him away. He's going to be a great nation. Somebody's got to work with him. And besides, he's my half brother. Why can't I work with him? Where does he go? In the story of Rebecca, Rivka comes, and she is going with Abraham's servant, who took her from the house of Laban and Bethuel, and she's now coming to meet her husband-to-be. It's a very interesting first meeting. She gets up with her female servants, and they're going on the camels, and she's following the man, the servant of Abraham. And they are now coming to Be'er Lachai Roi. Where's Be'er Lachai Roi? That's the place that Hagar and Yishmael lived. And it's in the Negev. And that's where Yitzchak is living. He's living in Be'er Lachai Roi. Continue the story for a moment, because it's a cute story. Isaac goes out into the field, and it's towards evening. And now this is interesting. Isaac lifts his eyes, and what does he see? He sees camels coming, which means it's close enough to see. At the same time, Rivka lifts her eyes, and what does she see? She sees Isaac. This also shows the difference between them. Rivka knows, she's wondering, she looks up, she sees Isaac. Isaac is a man who, since the time of the Akedah, of the experience of the binding and had this near-death experience, he's on a very high spiritual level. Slightly detached from day-to-day reality, you might say. He looks up, he only can see camels. He can't see the pretty girls seeing the camels. The camels coming. There's an interesting interpretation by the Netziv, that's Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berliner, who was the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva in the second half of the 19th century until it closed. Netziv says, the Talmud says that what was Isaac doing in that field? He was praying mincha, the afternoon prayer. So Isaac was a very spiritual person. Maybe he was waving his hands. He was very into devotion. Now, Rebecca is a believer, and that's why she wants to join the Abrahamic family. However, she doesn't come from such a religious family. They're actually pagans, Laban and Bethuel. So this is all new for her. So she's looking forward to this, but she's very nervous. And all of a sudden, she sees a man with great devotion praying in the field. And she says to the Eliezer, Abraham's servant, who's that guy over there? And he says, that's my master. That's the one. She's thinking, uh-oh, she falls off the camel. She's like completely beside herself. And then she pulls herself back together, and it says that she took the veil and put it over her face, because she knows she has to be especially modest in meeting a person like that. So it's very interesting. But the point I'm trying to get to is that Isaac is living in Be'er Lachai Roi from the time that he left the Akedah, Mount Moriah, the binding. He went to live with Ishmael. Why does he want to live with Ishmael? Well, you can give two possible answers. Answer number one, I heard one time, was that first of all, he wanted to talk to the only person in the world who knew what it meant to be a child of Abraham aside from himself, Ishmael. And besides, Ishmael, in a sense, went through something similar, a near-death experience when he was a child, because Sara wanted to banish him from the house, and God said, do it, whatever Sara says. And of course, he was saved just like Isaac was saved. But there's another reason too. Isaac says, look, I have to preempt. I have to fulfill my destiny. And if Ishmael is going to be a great nation too, then I have to work with him too. He's my brother-in-law. He's my half-brother. I need to show him the way. I need to guide him. I will build up my family, but I need to guide him. And even after Yitzchak marries Rivka, at the end of chapter 24, verse 16, he takes Rivka for wife, and he loves her. But at the end of the parasha, at the end of the this portion, after it talks about um, this is very interesting. Chapter 25, it says Abraham dies at a ripe old age, and he is buried by Isaac and Ishmael, his sons. Now Ishmael was older, so normally the older ones first. And he was buried in the cave of Machpelah. So the Midrash says something very interesting, and Rashi brings it. The Midrash says, why is Isaac's name first? Because Ishmael said to Isaac, I now get it. You give the guidance, I follow, but I got it. And Yishmael said to Isaac, I want your name to be first in the Torah. Okay, they didn't receive the Torah first, but the point is that Yishmael understood that his guidance comes through Isaac, and that was okay with him. And they still got along after that, even after Abraham died. It says, after Abraham died, God blessed Isaac, and Isaac remained in Be'er Lachai Roi, the neighbor with Ishmael. He didn't leave him. Because Ishmael is one of my brother, my half-brother, who I have to train him, I have to guide him. He needs me. So even though I'm building up my own family now, I'm not going to leave him. And then at the end of this parsha, tells about the children of Yishmael and who they are, the 12 princes of Ishmael, which sort of reminds us of the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 and 12, I mean. So, what does that mean? The Zohar says that Yishmael, I have to explain though something before I get to the Zohar, because the Zohar is a little bit more militant than the simple meaning than the Midrash. From the Midrash's point of view, it appears that Isaac and Yishmael get along. In fact, the Talmud says about Yishmael that he was chozer b'tshuva. He was penitent. He turned back. He had gone off the path, but he came back because of the guidance of Isaac, back into the fold. Whereas if you look at, Isaac tries to do the same thing with Esau. Jacob is the one who's going to continue the line of Abraham, but Isaac spends a lot of time with his son Esau because he wants to also guide him. It doesn't work as well with Esau, but with Yishmael it does, according to the Midrash. There are rabbinic interpretations, and Yishmael comes back to the fold. If I'm going to say there is a rule of thumb of Nachmanides in the 13th century, and he basically says, Maseh avot siman lebanim. Whatever happened among the patriarchs and the matriarchs in the Bible, this is going to happen in future times too. So if Ishmael is going to be the Arab nation, and there might be certain tensions between the Jews and the Arab, which I'll talk about in a moment based on the Zohar, these tensions can be resolved. And they will be resolved through guidance that the children of Isaac will guide the children of Ishmael. Now, today we have the Abraham Accords. It's a very important thing. It is the children of Isaac and the children of Ishmael and other Muslim countries getting together. But it cannot be just political. It has to be discussion. Because if there's one thing which is a common denominator between us, the children of Isaac and the children of Israel, is that we are deep believers. Even if among us there are some who are, let's say, not as skilled in those things. But in general, we're deep believers. We have a lot to talk about. And through the Torah that we received in our traditions, there's a lot of guidance and advice that we can give the children of Yishmael to help them understand their own tradition and also the mutual tradition. As you know, the Quran has many, many places where it quotes the Torah. And since it quotes us in our Torah, meaning these are things that we can explain the way that we understand them. And this, in my opinion, will bring the actual peace in the Middle East. I'm not poo-pooing the political alliances, but what will bring the actual peace, long-term peace in the Middle East, will be the future understanding of the intellectuals, the religious intellectuals of the Jews and the children of Yishmael, of the Arabs. This will create a lasting understanding and therefore a lasting peace. Not just based on what can I get out of this, but based on an understanding of similar common denominators in our belief systems, which is very important. Now, to end this, before I end this off, I want to talk about two places which are talk about some of the chikuchim, some of the frictions which will happen between the children of Ishmael and the children of Isaac, according to the book of Zohar. This first one is actually taken from Zohar on Shmot, on Exodus. And there are actually quite a few places where Zohar talks about this, and since this is sort of like a succinct and very small, very short, I thought this would be appropriate because I don't want to overdo this discussion. And the Zohar says, this is Va'era 32a. And I will translate. I have the Hebrew translation because the Zohar is in Aramaic. I'll translate it into English. For some reason, I had difficulties finding the English, so I'll just translate it. So the Zohar said, remember, Abraham starts by saying to God, this was in Parashat Lech Lecha, you're telling me I'm going to have a child. What's wrong with Yishmael? He can also live before you. But then God said, no, you're going to have Isaac. So, and then the Zohar says, for 400 years, the administering angel in rabbinic thinking, every nation has an administering angel, which is in charge, which is like the spiritual root of that nation. The administering angel of Ishmael stood for 400 years before God and said, if somebody was circumcised, do they have a place in your name? God said, of course. And so the angel said, well, Yishmael, who I represent, he was circumcised. Why doesn't he have a place like Isaac, which also means a place in the land of Israel? And then in this parley, God answers, well, he was circumcised, but not the correct way. There's a different way between the way Jews circumcise and the Ishmaelites, and it's called Milah and Priya. They do Milah without Priya. It's a technical thing, but anyhow. And not only that, but the Jews are with the children of Isaac, meaning the children of Jacob, they connect to me already within those 8 days, whereas your children are a little bit further from me. And then it goes on, and it says, then the Zohar, of course, as I said, starts saying, okay, we have to be woe to this discussion, it says. But then it continues. And then the time will come when the children of Ishmael will control the Holy Land for quite a long time. And they'll control the Holy Land. And why will they control the Holy Land? Because they demanded through the administering angel to have a place in the land. Now, the land's not that big. So how can it be both for Ishmael, which represents many nations, and for the children of Jacob and the children of Jacob of Isaac? So the compromise was that Ishmael will control the land as long as the children of Jacob are not there. And that way they will have their chance at it. But they will control it when the land is barren. Why when the land is barren? To show the difference that their circumcision is different than the circumcision of the children of Jacob. I'm going to understand this as a metaphor, which means the children of Jacob have a certain understanding of how to cling to God, which they have to share with Yishmael before he can actually say that his connection is correct, what I call the guidance. So the land will be empty under them. But this will hold back the children of Israel of coming back to the land until the merit of Ishmael will run out. We mean the merit of their demand to have the land, the merit will run out. Now, what does it mean the merit will run out? I'll tell you an explanation I heard from one of my teachers, Rabbi Raffeld, Professor Meir Raffeld, a blessed memory, who said, it means, what does it mean the merit run out? He says, Yishmael will be given a chance to control the Holy Land because of his Brit Milah, because of his circumcision, which they do to this day. And it will be equal to the time that the children of Jacob were there. How will that happen? So the way I've heard different ways to work this out is something like this. If you look how long the Israelites controlled the land before the destruction of the Second Temple. So in the book of Kings, it says that, I think it's chapter 6, says 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt, Solomon built the temple. So we know that until the building of the temple, there was 480 years. So now you would say there's 40 years in the desert, but the truth is that the Jews were actually supposed to go, the Israelites are supposed to go directly into the land. It was only because Chet Hamaraglim, the sin of the spies, that they were held back for those 40 years. So they actually, you might say, already had the legal control of the land from that point. So we have 480 years. Then according to our tradition, the first temple stands for 410 years. And after the Babylonian exile, the second temple stands for 420 years. Put that all together, 480, 410, and 420, you have 1,310 years that the Israelites, the people of Israel, controlled the land of Israel. In the year 638, Omar conquers Jerusalem. And it's controlled by various groups, but the vast majority of them were Arabs, Muslims, and the Ottomans for a very long time, and the Mamluks, and etc. And finally, the children of Israel get it back in 1948. From 638 to 1948 is exactly 1,310 years. That is when the merit runs out for the Brit Milah, for the circumcision of Yishmael. But he does get a chance to control the land for that long. That was the interpretation I heard. Now, it continues here and talks about wars that will happen. The children of Ishmael will create very great wars. And then the people of Edom usually means the West, will also fight them, both on the sea and on the land. And one of these fights will be very close to Jerusalem. And they will control Jerusalem for a while, but it will not be controlled by the West. And then there'll be a great war over Rome. And it'll happen for 3 months. And many nations shall fall from the children of Edom. And then God will be aroused, and he will stop the children of Ishmael from controlling the land anymore, meaning the land of Israel. And all the powers from above will also be stopped. And the only controlled power will be for the power of the children of Israel in the land, etc., etc. So basically, as I said, when the children of Israel take over, the other nations who've been fighting over this land for 1,310 years, their power will be taken away, but it doesn't mean that they'll necessarily try to stop. We have another midrash. It's found in a collection called the Yalkut Shimoni. Others have heard this too, and this one I actually found it online, so I will show it to you. Very interesting Yalkut. I heard this when I was a young man because Rabbi Drukman quoted it. Rabbi Drukman, or Chaim Drukman, of blessed memory, my rabbi, quoted it when I was a young man because of the First Lebanon War. But its truth is that it probably applies more today than it did then. Yalkut Shimoni on the prophets, it's 499. And it's talking about a lot of things here about the Messianic times, the end of days, specifically the Messiah of Ephraim, which is very interesting. Don't have a lot of sources like that. But also brings an interesting story, which, or I don't know exactly story, but an interesting statements. So this is towards the end here. Just give me a moment. Rabbi Yitzchak said, in the year that King Messiah will appear, in the beginning of the Messianic times, all the kings of the nations will be at each other. And the king of Persia will make problems with the king of Arabia. And the king of Arabia will turn to Aram, which means Syria. By the way, there's another nusach, there is another version of this, and instead of Aram, it says Edom, which means the king of Arabia will turn to the west, take advice. And then he'll go back to the king of Persia. Together, they will destroy the whole world. All of the nations will be in turmoil and will be shouting and falling on their faces. And there'll be great suffering. And Israel will also be calling out and shouting and will be in great turmoil. And will say, where are we going to do? Where are we going to go? What are we supposed to do? God will say to them, my children, do not be afraid. Everything I did till now, I did only for you. So why are you afraid? This is the time of your redemption. And the first redemption is not like the final redemption. The first redemption of Egypt, it was difficult and you were enslaved and there were various nations who exiled you after this. But the final redemption is without pain, without enslavement, without being exiled by nations. So here we have this very interesting thing. I'm only quoting it because it slightly reminds us of what we just went through with the Persians, with the Arabian Empire, which were the Ishmaelites, the Arab Empire trying to connect to each other and coming against the Jews. And then they take advice either from Syria or from the West. And I think it makes more sense the West here, because unfortunately, there have been a lot of groups in the West who've been coming to the aid of, unfortunately, the groups from Iran and the terrorists from Iran and from the Hezbollah and from the Hamas, etc. I'm not saying the majority, but there definitely were groups who shared sympathies with the terrorists instead of the victim in this case. And it says in the end that despite the havoc that will be caused by these groups from Iran and from various groups of terrorists, and I don't even blame all of the Muslim states because, it's the fanatics who are doing this. But unfortunately, because they're going to have a lot of collaborators, it'll be difficult, but it will be overcome. And since we have a promise already that Ishmael and Isaac can get together, so I think it's time for us as Jews to make inroads with our brethren among the Arabs. Inroads, I believe it should be not just political, as I said, but religious inroads. To talk about guidance, to talk about visions of a better world, a world where belief in God brings moral clarity and righteousness and justice and peace. Amen.